Well, about 40 years ago, one of the pastor's wives came to me and asked me if I would conduct a Seder. I'd been teaching Bible class and she had been in my class, and she asked me if I would conduct a Seder. Well, I'd been to dozens of Seders as a kid, but I'd never conducted one on my own. So the first time I did it, first thing I had to do is I had to rework the program because the Seder lasts about 4.5 hours, and I knew that wouldn't fly. So I reworked the program, made sure all the elements were there, but made sure it flowed a little bit better and faster. The other thing I had to do was ask the Lord, how did I want to intersperse a messianic message in the Seder? Because that's what it is. And so I put together the program, and she had rented a very large hall, which I did not realize. We got there, it was my wife and I and our two teenage kids. And there were hundreds of people there. And she had it all set up in rows and very, very well organized. And so I got the family, and the four of us went behind a curtain, and we just prayed that the Lord would get us through it the first time. First time I was pretty nervous because I wanted not just to present, but to put a message across. On the other hand, I'd never done that before. So it was a great experience, but it was a little mind-boggling to start with. Well, it's completely different as a feeling for me now as a great-grandfather from the time when we first started 40 years ago. First of all, we've probably done north of 75 or 80 of these. I lost count. But I can do it in my sleep now. I don't really need the program. I know what I'm supposed to do. But it feels a lot deeper. The spiritual message to me feels a lot deeper, and I feel like my role that the Lord has given me is to express that message in a different kind of way, so that people can really grab onto the idea that God has done something amazing over 5,000 years now, and we're still doing the same thing that He told the Israelites to do during the Exodus. But the meaning of it on this side of the cross is so powerful, and my heart just wants people to really understand it. The other thing is, for me, our family has grown from what we call the original 4 to 29 people. I have great-grandchildren now, lots of them, and I just want that message to fulfill what God told us to do in Deuteronomy, and that is to teach my children, my grandchildren, and now my 8 great-grandchildren what the message of the Lord is, so that they can latch on to it as well. My hope is that somebody in the family will pick this up and do it in the future. But I'm so excited for the opportunity to see all my family around me and have an opportunity to teach them what God has done for us. I'm often asked about how a kid from Brooklyn got to be Messianic Jew, and I thought I'd give you a little, some of the highlights of our family story. Our first immigrant was my great-grandfather, whose picture is up here on the wall. He was a rabbi. He was from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which was way before World War I. About the year 1880, he picked up his wife and his 5-year-old son, and he decided that he would come to America because the persecution against the Jewish people in that part of Europe was awful. And he had come from a long line of rabbis. Uh, I was able to trace our family lineage back from him 4 more rabbis before him. And so he came to America with his 5-year-old little boy, who became my grandfather. He married a woman that he met in New York, who was also from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And they had a bunch of kids, and after my grandfather, who was 5 at the time he came, as I said, and that little boy grew up, and he had married, and he had 3 children, the third of which was my father. My dad was born in 1912. They were very religious people. They kept the law as best they could. They were strictly kosher, and my dad grew up in that environment. My mom's parents were Ukrainian Russian Jews, and they came to America in a different kind of way. The first one to come was my grandmother. She was about 15 years old. She grew up in a small village west of Kiev, a little Jewish village, maybe 1,000 people. Kind of like if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, that's kind of what it looked like. She was the oldest of several children. She was very, very small, maybe 4'11", tough personality. Her mother, whose name was Leah, my grandmother's name was Ida, her mother Leah sewed money into the hem of her dress and sent her off to New York. Now that may sound crazy to us, but in that day and age, with all the religious persecution and the horrors of living under the Tsar and the Cossacks and all the things that you've seen maybe on Fiddler on the Roof, it was really, really difficult for those people. And so my grandmother, her job was to get to New York, get a job, and send money back so her siblings could come. Her father died young, and her mother's brother actually cared for the family. So my grandmother, my little grandma Ida, made her way from the Ukraine to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, about 1,500 miles, mostly walking, always at night for safety, because young women at that time, even then, had to be very careful. It was kind of like the Underground Railway that we had in America years ago, where people would meet you along the way and help you. Sometimes she said she got to ride in a cart, but mostly it was walking. She got to Amsterdam. It took her 3 months to get to Amsterdam. She went down to the dock and bought a ticket on a freighter from Amsterdam to New York. But she told me it was 3 days from the time she bought the ticket until the boat was ready to leave. And she said, just like this, she said, Amsterdam was a very wicked town. I could remember that finger going like that. And still is. And so she hooked up with 2 other young women who were doing the same thing. They were able to find a place to sleep for a couple nights, and then she made her way to New York. She got to New York, to Ellis Island. When she got off the boat, she explained to me, people would meet us at the boat, and they'd begin talking. And if we understood the language, and my grandmother spoke Russian, and she spoke Yiddish. So people would talk to them, and if they understood the language, they would meet them, they would take care of them, they would find them a place to sleep. They would ask them, what do you want to do? My grandmother got a job as a sewing machine girl in the what used to be the Garment Center. Garment Center is now in Asia, as you know. But then it was in New York, and she made clothing. And she went to the synagogue, as she usually did, and she met a young man there. My grandfather was 6 years older than her, and he also came from the Ukraine, a different village. And in 1905, a war broke out between the Russians and the Japanese. And so the Tsar sent his soldiers into all the villages, and they scarfed up all the young men, and they impressed them into the military. And my grandfather was impressed into the Russian Navy, and he was sent to Vladivostok, which is on the east, way out on the east of Siberia, to be in because that's where the war was going on. By the time he got there, the war was over. The American president, Theodore Roosevelt, had made a peace treaty, helped them come to a peace treaty, and the war was over. Well, you just didn't go home. Once you were in the Tsar's Navy, you were in the Tsar's Navy. And so in order to get out of the Navy, the only way you could do it was to have been injured. So he punctured his eardrum on the right side, and he got a medical discharge. Somehow, I never found out, he never told me, he made his way from Vladivostok all the way across the Eurasian continent to Liverpool in England. He got on a boat, came to America, went to the synagogue, met my grandmother. Now, if that's not the Lord, I don't know what it is. That's just amazing to me. But he was always deaf on this side. And I'll tell you how I knew about it as a kid. Anyway, they got married in 1912, and my mother was born 2 years later in 1914. And my mother was also a very small woman. Maybe she hit 5'1" if she stood on her tippy toes. Also, like her mother, strong woman. And she married my dad in 1935, and my great-grandfather performed the ceremony, which is really kind of remarkable. He passed away not long after that in his late 80s. But that's an incredible story. I just love telling it, frankly. I was born in 1938. I was the firstborn son of my parents and the firstborn son of both my grandparents on both sides. That is a big deal. I was supposed to become the next rabbi. And so from the time I was 9 till my bar mitzvah when I was 13, I was released from public school to go to a very religious Jewish school where I was taught Hebrew and I was taught Torah. And so I was immersed by the rabbis in those two things. And at the age of 13, I went through the bar mitzvah ceremony where I got these. Bar mitzvah ceremony is kind of interesting in an Orthodox environment. Only the men are allowed to sit on the ground level. The women are in the balcony with a veil in front of them. My mother used to say, there's the lords of the universe down there. She didn't take to that stuff. But in any case, I was asked to, as a 13-year-old boy, to get the honor of carrying the Torah around the synagogue so that they could take this extra thick part of the tassel, round it around their fingers and kiss it. That's a big honor, and I got to do that. It was really kind of a scary experience for a 13-year-old boy at the time, but I just went through it because I was supposed to go through it. That's what you do when you're 13. Fast forward a few years, I went to college. There's only two things I wanted to do when I was in college. One was play baseball, and the other one was fly airplanes. I couldn't hit a curveball, so that was out. So I became an officer in the U.S. Air Force. I graduated from college when I was 20 years old, and the Air Force, in its magnificent way of doing things, sent me from New York to Waco, Texas. Now, I didn't know there was anything worthwhile west of New Jersey. But when I got to Waco, it was the last part of October, just about now, 1959. And as you know, in October, we can have weather like cool, or we can have weather like hot. It was hot. So I said, hey, this is great. It's October, wonderful. I'll go swimming. I went to the base swimming pool. They had a lock on the gate, closed for the winter. Okay, I'm not in Kansas anymore, so Dorothy said. Well, the best thing was I got to meet the young lady who has been my wife for 60 years now. Pat was sent to Baylor University by her dad, who was a preacher. She grew up in Brazil as a missionary's kid, and her dad sent her to Baylor to marry a preacher, and she came home with a Jewish kid from Brooklyn. So you never know what your kids are going to bring home. We fell in love in Waco about 2.5 years later. I was in California and going through a new Air Force school to fly a brand new airplane, which is very interesting because that brand new airplane was called a B-52, and they're still flying 60 years later. But anyway, I was going through school, and we decided she was only a junior when I met her, so she had another 1.5 years of college to go. And when she graduated, she got on a train and she came out to California. She got a job teaching school. We had been together a few times during that 2.5 year period, but we were married in June of 1962, and her dad married us. In the meantime, what had happened to me when I was in Waco is a lot of people, as you know, in Waco who consider that place, as you know, Jerusalem on the Brazos. They would come, and they had never met anybody who was Jewish. And so they would start witnessing to me, and they would do this and say this, and I would sit there, oh, that's fine, yes, it was very nice. When I was in Hebrew school, the rabbis had a process to teach us how to study Scripture. And the Scriptures that we have, the 5 books of Moses, have interpretations from various rabbis. It's in a book called the Talmud. And the rabbis would sit us across a table from each other, like Steve and I would be across a table from each other. And Rabbi said, okay, pick a chapter, Exodus chapter 12. And I want you to argue Rabbi A's position, and Steve, I want you to argue Rabbi B's position, and try to convince each other that this interpretation is better than this interpretation. And so that's how they taught us to dig deep, to peel the onion back, so to speak, to get into the Word, to truly understand it. And so we would begin the discussion, which would turn into a yeah, but, argument. And then the rabbi at the appropriate time would snap his fingers, and I'd have to take Rabbi B's position, and he'd have to take Rabbi A's position, and we'd have to go back at it again because he wanted us to understand that both positions could be right. And so we did that. So here I am in Waco, and people are telling me, well, Jesus said this and this, and I would say, Okay. So why did he say it? Well, he said it. Yeah, I know. But what did he mean by what he said it? So I said, okay. I was just curious more than anything. So I went to a small church outside, right out on campus, called 7th and James Baptist Church. And the pastor there was a man named Charles Welburn. And I made an appointment, I came in, I sat down, and I said, Pastor, I don't understand why people don't know the Old Testament. Why is that? Then I asked this question, and they don't have an answer. He was not surprised, okay? When you're dealing with college students, So he gave me this. This is the book he gave me. It's called New Testament, Old Testament Prophecy Edition. And he autographed it. April the 20th, 1960. He autographed it right there. And he said, why don't you start on page 1 and read it and look at the notations on the bottom, which will refer you back to the Old Testament. And then come back and we'll talk about it. So page 1, the Gospel according to Matthew. Now, my mind said Matthew is not a Jewish name. So this is a Gentile who wrote this? So I began reading, and you know what happened? I found out he was Jewish. I found out his name was Levi. I found out that he wrote this to Jewish people. I found out that he quotes the Old Testament up and down, left and right, all that kind of stuff. And I began reading this, and I said, wow. I had one of those moments, that head flattening moment. How come I didn't know this? Nobody ever told me this. I had one friend growing up who wasn't Jewish. And Jimmy was Catholic. And the only thing I knew about Jimmy was Saturday morning at 10 o'clock, he had to go to confession, and we had to play in the baseball game around his confession time. That's all I know. So I was reading this, and I sat down in my quarters at the air base, and I'm reading this, and I said, boy, this is incredible. This is unbelievable. And all I read was Matthew. And I became what you and I would call convicted that something was going on here. And I just needed to know what it was. And so I began to pray. When you don't have an answer, go to the source. So I began to pray. I said, Lord, I need to know what's going on here. And the more I prayed and the more I read, the more I became convinced that Jesus is exactly who he says he is. He is the Messiah of Israel. But it wasn't until I got to about chapter 10 or 11 where he says, if you love your father and mother more than me, then you're not worthy of me. Now, he doesn't say don't love your father and mother. He just says there's a hierarchy of love here. And so I thought, wow, this is amazing. By that time, I get my orders and I'm transferred out to California to that school I told you about. And I'm sitting there reading this, and I am really, really hurting. I am under, white knuckle kind of thing. I thought, okay, I am going to go to a church. what church do I go to? I've been in one church. When I was courting Pat, I've been in another church and I heard her father preach. Those are the only two churches I've ever been in. So I got out something which you may have heard of. It's called the Yellow Pages. And I opened up to church. And I was looking for a church that was near the Air Force Base. El Camino Baptist Church. I'll go there. The pastor was a man from Clovis, New Mexico. And at the end of the service, they had an altar call. I went up and I told him who I was, told him I'd been searching, told him what I'd been reading. He and his wife were wonderful. They invited me to lunch that afternoon. He was able to answer so many questions that I had in my mind about this and about that. And he was very, very good at it. And so on January 15th, 1961, at the age of 22, I gave my life to Christ and I was baptized in his church. And God has done a marvelous work in our lives. As I said, Pat grew up as a missionary kid, and we have really become a team together in ministry. Here at Fielder, we've had the opportunity to start, 15 or 20 different Bible classes over the years. They just kept breaking, multiplying. We've had an opportunity to serve in so many ways. Our family is just, God has provided an incredible family. In the 60 years we've been married, we've gone from 2 people to 29 now. Praise God. I was kidding her the other day. I said, but from the time that God called one man, Abraham, till the Exodus, which was 2,000 years, Abraham went from one man plus Sarah to 3 million. So I don't know if I'll go to 3 million in 2,000 years, but God has blessed while we're here. So it's been a joy to do this. And to me, it's a fulfillment to be with y'all tonight, to celebrate the Passover. As Derek mentioned, we've been doing this for 40 years now. These two were teenagers when we first started. A minister's wife challenged me to put together a Passover. The regular Passover, by the way, lasts for 4.5 hours. But I discovered that Christians cannot do 4.5 hours at a time. So an hour and a half is about the limit, and then we got to go have lunch, right? So it's a joy for us to be here with you. So that's how God has brought us to where we are tonight. And we're just so grateful for him, first of all, for his salvation, his grace, his mercy through the years. My wife and I are 84 years old now. We're relatively healthy. So I was telling one of our people, I have a new acronym, AHI. Age has issues. And we're dealing with those issues, but praise God, everything is going well for us.